But then I also was interested in family structure. Okay? So what I've done is, again, it's all very complicated, so don't worry too much about it. But what you get is a sense of the real diversity of the family unit. Is there a STEM extended family in Kilwater? You would have thought so from reading the census returns, but in fact, the majority of households in Kilwater are the nuclear family. Okay, 41% of families have a male head with a wife and children in the household, and that's it. No servants, no kin, no grandchildren. Okay, but what's really kind of interesting, again, I think, nuclear family, been there, done that. But what I think is more interesting is when we look at the proportion of women who are returned as heads of households. Okay? And again, we see here that you've quite often got a widow. Okay? So about 15% then of the total of heads of households are headed by widows who have their extended family living with them. Okay? And that might be it's really a real variety. Okay? So just to give you an example, those are my examples. If very, very briefly, if I could bore you. The classic example is Eliza Weir, who is returned as the head of the family, although her son and his wife are living with her and all of their children. Then you have someone like, for example, I don't have another example for those, but I think that's very interesting. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this is what I've called the so-called singles. Now, these are women who have returned themselves on the census as not married, but on the same return, they have children. Okay? So I'm like, okay, you say you're not married, but you've got grown-up children living with you. Does that mean that you see yourself as a widow, because you're not married anymore, but you haven't classified yourself as a widow? Does it mean that you had these children out of wedlock because you've never been married, and that you were cohabiting, but and where is your partner now? Okay, so we just don't know. Okay? The other thing you get as well is women who say that they are married and are living with children, but there's no husband present. Now, he could have been away, or the family unit could have broken up and they could be separated. Okay, so they're not really single, but they're kind of single, and certainly they're returned as heads of households. And I think that's quite interesting. And where you see the preponderance of these types of female-headed households is in Millbrook Village. Again, unsurprising, because all of these women and their dependents are all working in Millbrook factory as textile workers. Okay? So what I think is so interesting is that clearly, and a lot of, and again, if we crossed it again with where these women were born and where their families came from, what you would find is people coming from lots of different parts. So mobility for the people within Millbrook is much higher than it is for the population of Kilwater as a whole, where almost everybody is born in Antrim. And I think that's because the factory attracts people who are looking for work, perhaps attracts people who have non-traditional family units, who are struggling to maybe make it in a conventional economy, but find opportunities within the factory economy for work and survival. And I think that that's kind of interesting, really. Okay? And then what you can do as well then, finally, is to then look at the proportion of married women who are in the waged economy. And you can, again, sort of see that women clearly don't penetrate into the upper categories or the upper occupations, that they're largely clustered around the lower categories. And so this category here, right, of married women is almost all entirely women who define themselves as housekeepers. And I'm fascinated to know where they were housekeeping, or whether or not housekeeping was actually a paid employment or not. Maybe I've entirely interpreted that incorrectly, which could be true. Okay? But what's also interesting here is the number of married women who are working in the textile sector. Okay? Which is, again, not the norm, and it's becoming and was increasingly the norm within the textile industry. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what your average everyday person can uncover. And these are some of the census returns where you get a sense of the family unit. And this is Hugh Wilson, who's a wealthy farmer. He has a first-class home in Drumahoe. And you can see then that his wife is left unoccupied with no occupation, and that he has here 2 farm servants working for him, which again would be fairly unusual for Killwater. This is to give you an idea of a female-headed household census return. And you can see here Mary Fannin. She's the head of the family. She's a Presbyterian. She can read and write. She's 34. She's described as a linen winder, and it says that she's married. Okay? But over here you can see there's her daughter, Martha, who's not married. And she has a daughter, a son, and then she has a niece living with her who's 7. Okay? Why? How do these people come to be? And then finally, I thought, just to wrap up very, very quickly, since I've been kind of going on for a while now, is just to say a few things about my family, the Ogilvies. Although, and it's just to say really that, if I can find it, that this is what I've been able to kind of find out about my family over, I suppose, the last sort of 7 or 8 months that I've been working on. So you can see me way down there at the bottom. And really, the key family, or the key, I suppose, relationship in my family is that of Sam Martin and Susan Ogilvie. Okay? So in the 1901 census, Sam Martin is described as a cotton beamer. He's clearly working in Millbrook factory. And he's from County Down. Again, that sort of fits, doesn't it? And Susan Ogilvie is described as a housekeeper. Okay? What I've been able to do a little bit is to reconstruct her family, but mainly through church registers, whereas Sam Martin's family, you can find them through the censuses. Now, I can't remember if I included these. Yes, I did. So there's the census return for Sam Martin. Now, they live in Drumahoe, so they're still living out of the country. And you can see then that they've got their 2 daughters, Ellen and Mary, but they're also living with her brother-in-law. And I'm assuming that that's because they may have come from slightly farther away, and this is now closer to the factory, and it's handy for him, because he's described as a cotton weaver. Okay? Now, when we then, 3 or 4 houses down the road, there is Samuel Martin's mother, Ellen. Okay, and she's a widow, described as a yarn worker, aged 50. Okay, and she's living with her 2 sons, Hugh and James, who are both described as linen workers and unmarried. And so you can see how Ellen Martin's family kind of reflects the impact of the textile industry on family structure and household structure. By 1911, the factory had gone out of business, and Samuel Martin and his family had emigrated to Canada. And Ellen was left behind with and I think that this is, that's Ellen in the middle there. And that's Samuel Martin on the right-hand side. And Susan Ogilvie Martin on the far right-hand side. And so we think that Ellen may have gone out to Canada, but that she came back and was obviously then returned in the 1911 census, but with only 1 son, who's described as married, but has no wife with him. So, final thing is to say is that after I did this, I did a bit of poking around and managed to find, if we go back, the fact that Susan Ogilvy's father, Samuel, is amazingly enough returned in the 1851 census. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the 51 census, there are fragments of it that managed to survive the fire in the forecourts. And again, amazingly enough, there is a census return for John Ogilvy Sr., his family. He turns out to have had 8 children. And what's so interesting about the 1851 census, if you're lucky enough to have relatives in Antrim, is that on the back of the census form, it says, if you have children or members of your family who are no longer living with you but are still alive and living elsewhere, record them here. So what turns out is that his 4 eldest children had moved to Scotland as farm labourers, coal pit labourers, and as sowers. And what was so interesting as well was the frequency with which women were described as sowers in the 1851 census, and the fact that occupation by 1901 had virtually disappeared. And what we then see by 1911, was when you look at those, is that the number of women who are returned as unoccupied increases dramatically, even again. And so more and more women then, it seems to me anyway, so we'll need to check that. So anyway, so that's kind of the family unit. Did I find who the right Matilda, if you've been listening and wondering? No, I found another one instead. This one born in 1827. So I still have no idea who the Matilda is and how she's connected, but the quest continues. So for anybody who's thinking about doing a little counting exercise of their own, these are some of the notes that I used in my first aborted attempt to try and count the number of farmers and agricultural laborers in a much larger sample. And this is why if you have someone in your family who's good with computers, by all means get them to set you up, because this is really laborious. But it's very rewarding, and if you've got a flashy table, then it seems to suddenly look so much more authoritative. But you can certainly see that a very clean table or a pie chart masks what really is, I think, an incredible diversity of life at the individual level. And every time I generalize or put groups together, you're losing some of that rich detail of life at the local level. And so I think that when you're doing family history, while it's important to have these broader trends and these wider conclusions, I think it always needs to be balanced up against the rich diversity of family life and the unique stories which every family has and should try and celebrate. I hope you've enjoyed our lecture series. Thank you very much for coming. And I don't know, we're talking about maybe trying to do something again in the autumn. But enjoy your summer and happy researching.